Hello and welcome to sim.pc, where right now is 15:09, and I know, mates, I know that I didn't mention that yesterday, and it was sometimes that I missed it, but you can see it all here. Somewhere around here. You know, it's hard when you don't have the PowerPoint, I was going to say. It's hard when you don't have the Photoshop metrics in there in front of you to begin with, right? The structure in the video, because when I'm recording, well, I unfortunately don't have that. I'm making that in post-production, mates. I know, breaking all of the immersion. The other thing I'm going to mention is that, well, one of the drawbacks of recording a bit earlier than like 4 or 5, at least in Sweden, is that this. You see what I mean? The lighting, the unbalance on the lighting on the right and the left. And for you, it's going to be left and right, something like that, right? Because it's like opposite to me. Anyway, mates, the problem here is that I'm looking one way and it's like bright and the future is amazing and everything's good. And I'm looking to me left and it's like dark and gritty and everything's bad. How is that affecting you? Well, it's affecting you by the case that, well, there's one light and one dark side of the screen. Maybe that will affect the video quality. Hopefully it won't. I think that I made some tests and I didn't see any difference there, but hopefully this will be all fine, all good, all dandy. But I know most of you are just gonna sit there and be like, why is he talking about his room? I'm just here to listen to them questions because we're gonna take up matrices and stuff, and I want to know about that. Why should I avoid that, right? Why should I be avoiding that? And that is exactly what we're going to get into today. So just gonna move myself around here, read the exact phrasing of what we're gonna talk about today. Avoid using grids and matrices for responses. And before I'm recapping what we've been doing in the latest videos, right, I'm going to talk about a bit what is a matrix and what is a grid. Well, basically, mates, in the most simple way of putting this, imagine that you're having a y-axis and an x-axis. And on the y-axis, you have lots of different questions, all the way from, well, let's say 1 or 2 to 100 sometimes on one page. And then on the x-axis, you have lots of different answers. Maybe you have 2, 3, 15 I've seen, and that's, you know, information overload in my opinion, but whatever. That is basically what a matrix is, or a grid system. It is that when you're looking at the piece of paper, right? Yet again, this is more inclined to surveys. When you're looking at the piece of paper, you have lots of information. You have one row with all the questions, a row with all the answers, and then you have different, combinations of questions and answers in the middle of the page. It's kind of like a matrix system, actually. Yeah, that's kind of what it is. It's a matrix system with things going like this, and then this is like the answers, and this is a potential question. Then on the next potential answers, you have next potential questions. I know, and answers. I'm like, that was like, I think it's the most, probably the best description of a matrix and a grid like ever in the history of the internet. I don't think anybody can coin that better than I did. Anyway, mates, if you had a hard time understanding, I'm going to leave a picture or some link in the description to where they actually explain that. Anyway, but if you move into this video knowing what a grid and a matrix is, I'm going to talk about why you should avoid it. But before that, mates, we're going to talk a bit about, or rather recap a bit about what we've been doing so far in the past few videos. Just to put the context, tips and tricks for making an in-between question that is not too hard, not too easy, and is interesting to your audience. As we have stated a countless number of times at this point, we know that people tend to drift both in and out of conversation when not feeling engaged, which makes them having a hard time understanding the context in which a question is asked, and hence making said question, right, a harder to experience, even though it objectively, based on the other people in the room, might have been an easy one. So asking necessary questions in order to keep audience engagement is one thing, but it also needs to be kept short and simple. Not short in the sense that of a short discussion, but rather that the question should take about 15 to 30 seconds to formulate and not 10 long minutes. And simple, not in the way that it should be an easy question, but in the sense that it should have one objective to answer instead of 15 different ones. Ask direct questions, not aggressively direct, because you don't want to scare them, not abstractly indirect either, but direct enough so that the audience knows what you are looking for, what kind of answer you're looking for. Because if they don't, then they might think that the question is excessively hard or too easy based on the miscommunication, mate, between the speaker and the subject. The speaking probably being you and the subject being the audience. Posing one question at a time can help you as a lecturer or a teacher or whatever to control the development of the discussion while simultaneously engaging the audience through their own interaction in the form of answers. Plus, since the discussion will be broken up into different voices taking part, it is less likely for someone to drift out or completely fall asleep during a presentation of a subject. Avoiding leading and biased questions, no matter how good they might be to you and personally gain you, it generally does not benefit the group and the discussion. This approach might close out future perspectives that otherwise could have made the discussion better and more vibrant. Remember to speak your respondent's language in order to not alienate a part of your audience and make everyone feel engaged. Rather that you introduce new terms during the course of the session than being unsure if they know it from before. Sometimes people will think that it is boring, you introducing the same concepts over and over again, and sometimes you will add a different twist to the term and spark an interest in the subject yet again. This part is really hard and is unfortunately only gained through trial and error and error and error and error. Unfortunately, mates. Not something I can do about that. Use scaling whenever possible, when it makes sense, in order to make an easy question a bit more complex through adding another layer to the conversation and simultaneously making hard questions easier by letting the audience being able to rely on that, well, that's just my opinion, that's just how I feel. So mates, while recapping that, the review is going to be easy. The review at the end of all of these videos is just going to be me reading off all the things that I've written about each and every single little chapter and each and every single little video. It's just going to be me like, well, we've done the review already in every single video, but if this is the first video that you're watching, well, this is for you to put the context, mate, to make a context. Anyway, avoid using grids and matrices for responses. And I found a quote online that coined the phrase so perfectly that I just want to read it off. So, among the many sources of potential error that can affect a survey are respondents themselves, implying, right, that the people themselves are the main source of error when it comes to a survey. Why? Well, because most of the time they're the ones who's going to put in false things. Maybe they're in a rush, maybe they don't care about the survey at all, so they will put in things that you will later take for granted as scientific basis for your research. You will say, well, oh, people tend to think like this, but in all honest reality, they didn't think about that at all. They didn't think like that at all. They just put in things because, well, they didn't have time to finish it, or because they just didn't care, or because you asked them nicely and they were just, sure, I can put down some of my valuable time to do this, right? Takes about 5 minutes to do it, and you were like, I made the survey so that it would take 30 minutes, but whatever, you made it in 5. Anyway, continuing the quotes here. They sometimes misinterpret questions, respond in a socially acceptable way, or give easy answers in hopes that a more interesting question is just around the corner. So that was the end quotes, let's say, with me giving a bit of commentary in between. Now, in the later half here, they took up 3 important things, one of which we're going to focus on specifically in relation to matrices and grids, but other 2 that I think was very interesting. Sometimes they misinterpreted questions. This is mostly about, I would argue, when it's not the scaling option, because they can't rely on it's my own opinion. Now they might think that, oh, this is an objective question, so there is a right and a wrong here, and by thinking like that, they alienate themselves from their understanding that, well, no, I who made the survey was thinking about what you thought, but I just didn't phrase it like that, hence leading to the misinterpretation, right? And the other thing was respondents in a socially acceptable ways, and I thought that it was so interesting that they took up this, because I was like, yeah, that's true. Because if you're going to talk about how much you smoke, for instance, how much you drink, how often you sleep, how long you sleep, do you sleep 8 hours a night, are you stressed often, are you depressed, stuff like that, people tend to sometimes, right, because they're often writing their own names in the top of the survey, right, even though people are saying that we're not going to use your specific information, your personal information for this survey, for this research, but still, since you put your name on it, you're still thinking like, well, maybe they can trace this back to me, and I don't want that. So you tend to put more socially acceptable things on your answers. So even if you smoke, let's say, 15 packages a day, let's just say, right, you might still say that, just 1 or 2 cigarettes a day, something like that. Sometimes I don't smoke at all, because it's more socially acceptable to do that. If you're a heavy drinker, maybe you say that, well, I don't drink that much. Maybe because you're fooling yourself and you're not realizing that you're well, should we say, motivating an unquestionable behavior by a questionable criteria, or rather by a less questionable criteria, saying that I'm doing it, but I'm doing it less, right? But stuff like these that maybe you're tricking yourself, maybe you're trying to trick this, like the survey, maybe you're trying to not exclude how you're actually feeling and doing, and those are all things that is in human behavior. You want to be part of a group, you don't want to be alienated because you don't want to be yourself, because that is actually too much of a vibrant person, so that you stick out from the average too much, and then Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the pyramid there. Anyway, mates, that's not what we're going to talk about. Anyway, the last part here is something that I'm actually going to connect directly to matrices and grids, and that is, or give easy answers in hopes that a more interesting question is just around the corner. And what am I talking about here? Well, since we're talking about avoiding these kinds of stuff, it's important to say as well that if you're having this y and x-axis approach with grids and matrices, we have lots of different questions. As I said, sometimes I've seen as much as 100 questions on the y-axis, like on one A4 page is 100 different questions, and you're just like, I can't even read all of these because they're so tiny, or there's so much information, so I'm just getting cluttered in my mind before I even started. And sometimes they have as much as 10 to 15 different varieties of answers to each and every question, which makes the matrix huge. So when you look at the paper, you're just like, wow, there's text everywhere. This looks like a fluent text, but I can clearly see that they have lines as well. This is just messy and gritty. And when you have that sort of information overload due to, matrices and grids, when you check them, you're just like, well, okay, suppose I need to start this because I'm doing it for a friend, right? Or I'm interested in this subject, or I just have nothing better to do, right? You start maybe focusing on the first 4 or 5 questions, and then you start doing this approach, as we mentioned yesterday, this 1x2, 1x2, 1x2 approach, where you're just picking stuff randomly in a pattern because you feel like, well, I can't be bothered, right? So you're thinking like, oh, this was interesting, interesting, less interesting, not so interesting, I don't care anymore. So you're starting with this pattern, right? And then maybe that goes for 10 to 20 questions, and then you're like, oh, this is interesting, and then you review the latest question before that, and you're like, no, that was still uninteresting, but this is interesting. Maybe you spend like a minute or 2 on that question, and then you put a reasonable answer, and then you read the next question, it's uninteresting again, and you just keep going with your pattern until it's done. And this is kind of what they're saying, that, well, the highest potential error when it comes to surveys is the respondents themselves, because they can tend to, indulge in this kind of behavior. They can do these kind of things, which is bad for you who's made the survey. Yet again, I'm just going to say, before I'm coming to an end and a conclusion about this, since we've introduced the problem here, right, that this can happen due to matrices because there's information overflow and overload, right? In comparison to if you're using scaling, where people always can reference to, oh, it's myself, right? People don't tend to analyze each and every question in a matrix when it's subjective answers, as they do when it's just 1 or 2 questions at a page, and maybe it's like 50 pages or something, but at least it looks less. And when it's connected back to themselves, like, what do you think, what's your opinion about this? This is more like objective things, like it's more like a robotic system, so people don't think to analyze each and every question equally as much as they would do if it's scaling. Anyway, as I was going to say, mates, I don't even remember what I was going to say. So the thing that I was gonna add there, and I know that it was like an obvious clip here, but that was because, well, I forgot my reasoning, so I had to actually stop and review the tapes, so to say, review the tapes. I know, I'm like a cop, and I had to see, like, where was I going? And yes, what I was gonna add before the end was that my opinion about surveys, right? Because they're saying in the context there, or rather in the quote, that, well, the main potential problem for errors when it comes to answers is actually respondents themselves. And I kind of can see where they're coming from there. People might not have the time, they might not have the interest, they might lack the interest halfway through, stuff like that, etc., etc. And that is true, but my opinion is still the same as when it comes to a speaker and an audience. I think that 90% of the responsibility of keeping the engagement is on the speaker, and only 10% is on the audience. The same goes for when you're making a survey, because if you made a survey correctly, the people are going to take it, is going to feel engaged. They want to make it, like, they want you, or need to make the survey in a way that makes people want to make the survey. Do you see what I'm saying here? So I would still argue that 90% is on you, and if you've done your job correctly, then the 10% of them just keeping engaged and, breathing and listening and reading, that will be natural for them because they like what you've been doing. So in order to end this, we're just going to say that I'm just going to read off the quote again in a sense, but I'm going to change some things that we've been discussing so far. Among the many sources of potential error that can affect surveys are respondents themselves, or arguably the person who has made the survey, depending on how you view the responsibility of keeping engagement on the person who has made the survey and the people who takes the survey. You can also relate this to the person who is making a speech and the people who are listening to the speech. I would argue it's kind of the same thing. I know it's completely different contexts, I know it's completely different formats, but I will still argue that it holds. They sometimes misinterpreted questions, respond in socially acceptable ways instead of what you, as this guy who has made the survey, or the girl who made the survey, the person who's made the survey, wanted them to respond. Maybe you want them to be really honest, but they actually respond in a socially acceptable way, hiding their true nature. Or give easy answers in hopes that a more interesting question is just around the corner. Yet again, this idea of they're not actually analyzing every question, so they're not thinking it's interesting because they don't actually set themselves into the situation and the context. They just say that, well, it's boring, right? So just keep going, just keep going, just keep going. And this is interesting, and then they might have skipped 15 different questions, which is not good either. That's not what you want them to do. So try to avoid using grids or matrices when it comes for gaining responses, because the problem is, and the potential critique here is that you might make an information overload, which will lead to these kind of problems. But I would argue that you should include them in some manner, in some way, because it's good. In some signs, like if you have lots of them, it's really bad. Even if you have a small amount of them, it's still bad. Maybe if you have one and the rest are scaling, that's fine. And you put in the questions in the grid, which you cannot use scaling for. I think that's a good balance, even though many people will tend to disagree with that. So if you do, please leave a comment in the comment section below and join in on the conversation. Why do you think it's good? Why do you think it's bad? Do you think that I was correct? Do you think I wasn't correct? Is there a perspective that I obviously missed? Is there a perspective that I took up that you didn't know about before? Did you learn something? Was it something that you thought was outrageously crazy? Please join in the comment section below and let's learn together, mates. I know, cringy, am I right? But, you know, you gotta have some slogan and inner peace that it says on my logo isn't the best. Anyway, have a nice one, mates, and I'll see you tomorrow.